Welcome to the Nerd Party.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Missing Frames. This is the podcast where we watch all the movies we should have seen by this point in our lives. I'm your host, Shawn Eastridge. We're just hanging out over here on the Nerd Party Network. We've got all kinds of cool podcasts over here, like Nerd Nuptial, Aggressive Negotiations, that's Star Wars, in case you're wondering, and SETI Alpha 3, that's Star Trek, in case you're wondering. Also, the A24 Project, that is neither Star Wars nor Star Trek, but it's all about movies, specifically A24 distributed movies. So check all that stuff out on thenerdparty.com. You can also follow us at Join Nerd Party, like the Facebook page, The Nerd Party, and follow us on Instagram at The Nerd Party. Oh, that's a lot. But more importantly, we're here to talk about a little movie that's celebrating a 40th anniversary this year. That would be Star Trek, the motion picture. And here on Missing Frames, we're watching all kinds of 40th anniversary movies. I feel like that's the theme of Missing Frames for the past couple months. But I had to bring a Star Trek expert onto the show. So for the first time ever, we have Leah Hale making her Missing Frames appearance. Welcome, Leah, to the show.
Thank you, Shawn, and I wish you hadn't called me a Star Trek expert. That puts the pressure on.
No pressure whatsoever. And we also have TC Padgett returning to the show.
Shawn, I can't believe you're not sick of me yet.
I can't believe you're wearing a Star Wars shirt to a Star Trek podcast.
I mean, it wasn't my intention to start a gang war, but we'll see what develops.
We'll see how it goes. But this is another 40. You were here to celebrate Aliens' 40th anniversary because you'd never seen that.
And celebrate we did.
We celebrated so much, and now we're going to be celebrating Star Trek the Motion Picture, which you have also never seen before, TC.
Correct. That's why I'm here.
That's why you're here. That's why we're all here. So I'm excited about this. Star Trek the Motion Picture is a divisive film, to say the least. But Leah, as the resident Star Trek expert of this episode, we'll clarify. We'll just say Missing Frames resident Star Trek expert for this specific episode.
That takes the pressure down.
Pressure off. Good. So I want to ask you, first and foremost, you, of all the people in this room, I think you are the biggest Star Trek fan. Would you agree with that?
I think that's true.
So, okay, so good. We're taking the pressure off. No stress whatsoever. So do you remember how your love of Star Trek began?
Yes, it began when I was a kid, and my dad was a huge Star Trek fan. And he was a big fan of the original series, and then he was also a big fan of The Next Generation. So much so that he would read the newspaper and he would take notes on all of the rumors that were coming out about The Next Generation before it aired. And he passed all those notes on to me. So he has his nerd notebook. And so he watched the show a lot, specifically The Next Generation when I was a kid. And that's when my love for it started, even though I wasn't watching it a lot myself at the time. I just really loved Worf, and I loved his forehead.
Who doesn't love Worf's forehead?
Who doesn't? And I loved Geordi, and I always wanted to put my headband in front of my eyes and be like Geordi. The way he sees things is really cool.
It is.
Yeah, he sees lights and colors, and that's all really cool. But yeah, my own interest in Star Trek really blossomed a long time later. It was after college when I decided that I wanted to pick back up that Star Trek love and watch through the series. So I watched all the way through all of the series.
Did you just start at the beginning with the original series?
No, I started with Next Gen, and I watched all the way through that. And then I started mixing in the others. I think the original series was one of the last ones that I watched all the way through.
Interesting, okay.
That one in Enterprise. And Deep Space Nine was the one that really hooked me. That one became my favorite.
That's so interesting. Everybody, so I know we've talked about this, but anyone who's a real passionate Star Trek fan seems to cite Deep Space Nine.
It's so
the best
good.
One. Yeah, but more casual Star Trek fans are all it's fine. But I've never. I feel like across the board, all the people in the Nerd Party who love Star Trek would all. I think pretty much all of them agree.
And they're
Deep
all
Space
right.
Nine's the best. And they're all 100%
it's
correct.
Totally correct. Deep Space Nine is the best. But let's see, where was I going with that?
You just love Star Trek.
So I kept watching it, and I watched through all of the series, and then I watched through all of the series again. And I've seen most of the episodes a few times now, but the movies are actually not my favorites. I don't love a lot of the movies, and I don't love the motion picture that much, actually.
That's another thing about Star Trek fans is I think they would agree with you, where the movies are kind of like second fiddle and the TV shows where it's
There's something a little bit different about them.
Yeah. But TC, what do you like? TC, where's your head at? Where's your heart at when it comes to Star Trek?
That's a question outside of this pod. Well, when it comes to Star Trek, okay. I'm okay with Star Trek. It intrigues me. I can see the appeal. I didn't grow up with anyone in my life who was particularly in love with it, so I wasn't really exposed to it until randomly my dad took me to see First Contact in the theater, and he wasn't a fan as far as I know. So he never talked about Star Trek.
I think Board bring everybody in.
Honestly, I kind of think so. Like, I think he just wanted a good sci-fi movie. I don't know, but we went to see that. I don't remember feeling any particular way about that movie one way or
you were
another.
like, I love this guy Worf's forehead. This is the best part of the movie.
There were Star Trek books. I remember in 4th grade, my teacher had some random like trivia and fact books for TOS and The Next Generation that I flipped through. Learned some things there, but I was a Star Wars kid.
Yeah,
I don't like to think of it now as a dichotomy, like you have to like one or the other. But I feel like as a kid, I did.
But
kind
you
of.
Absolutely, do.
I certainly chose my side. So outside of First Contact,
and
I
you
had
have
basically
today
no.
too. I mean, you are wearing a Star Wars shirt. You're making a statement.
It was clean.
It's funny. I am kind of a Star Wars kid too. If we have to pick a side. But why should we pick a side? Because really there's so much to love about both of them. But
Truly.
My relationship with Star Trek, what's funny is I kind of grew up with The Next Generation happening. Like it was like on television, and that was what I knew about Star Trek. And I discovered the original series through the original Nintendo video game.
Wow.
I was like, what is this? And my dad's like, oh yeah, it's Spock and Kirk. Those are the guys. And the Nintendo video game had like a really like hip version of the Star Trek theme song, which the Star Trek theme song on the show is just kind of like, it's very goofy. It's a great theme, but it's also like the singing is very goofy. And I thought it was like really cool in the video game, the like MIDI version of it. And I convinced my dad, I was like, well, let's rent a movie, a Star Trek movie like of the original cast, thinking that I would get the same like colored uniforms, the yellow and blue that were in the video game. I would get a Captain Kirk that had the same hairstyle he did in the TV show, and thinking I would get that theme song. And we got none of the above. We got Star Trek 3. That was my first encounter with Captain Kirk and everybody. And the theme song wasn't in it. Captain Kirk's hair was brown and curly as opposed to kind of like blondish and combed and straight.
Yeah.
And I was very distraught about it. And Spock wasn't, that was the search for Spock. Yeah. Spock wasn't even in the movie until the end.
And all of the characters are grown up and everyone's so different. And it's more about like,
it's also a part 2. It's kind of it's a continuation. It's a direct continuation of Wrath of Khan. So not having seen Wrath of Khan, it probably wouldn't have made any sense to me.
Not the best place to jump in.
No, but my love of Star Trek for a long time was really limited to the movies, because I'm a bigger movie guy than a TV guy. Because the way I want my stories to go is I want there to be a beginning, middle, and end, and then we're good. You told the most emotionally impactful story you possibly could have. With TV shows, they go on and on and on, and then they go past the point of creative ideas. They go past the point they should have stopped, and I'm like, I'm done with this. I don't want anymore. So for a long time, I was very much like, I love the Star Trek movies. Maybe someday I'll get around to watching the show. And eventually I did get around to watching the show, and I watched the original series and really enjoyed it. But Next Generation, I like adored. After the first couple seasons, I was like, I finally understand why people love Star Trek so much. Also, I understand why people prefer it as a television show, because it is much better as a television show.
It's a whole other animal for sure.
Yeah. So I first saw the motion picture. I think we just rented it from the local library. And as a kid, for some reason, I loved it. Like, I would watch it on repeat. which, having seen Star Trek the motion picture since, is baffling to me. It is not a film I think a 10-year-old kid should pick as his go-to Star Trek movie.
That's really interesting, though.
And it kind of opened up the door for me to enjoy. It's very, very inspired by 2001: A Space Odyssey. Mm-hmm. So I think it opened up the door for me years later to really embrace that film. But Robert Wise, the director of this film, was an established, acclaimed director. He'd done Sound of Music. He'd done The Day the Earth Stood Still. He was like a legit Hollywood director. So it was a big deal for him to be attached to this project. And it had a big budget. They were really, Paramount, I think, had seen the success of Star Wars, and they were like, "Don't we have one of those star things? Let's put it into a movie." Because originally it was supposed to be a TV series. It was going to be a sequel series to Star Trek, and it was going to basically be the next generation before the next generation. Mm-hmm. And there were like kind of characters that would end up becoming different characters in the next generation. But for a while it was called Phase 2, and they were just going to make it a new series.
Yep.
And then it became the motion picture when Star Wars became huge and Paramount wanted to make more money.
And then someone made a fan series called Phase 2, picking it back up.
Yeah, so they took the idea and ran with it.
Oh, it's kind of a remake of original series episodes. But
nice. But the motion picture, when it was released, was it was a huge movie. It was a big risk for Paramount because they'd gone into the budget had gone way overboard. I don't know if they'd gone over schedule, but there was a lot of risk on this project because they'd spend so much money. A friend of mine, Brad Gullickson, who is on the Rest in Pictures podcast and does all kinds of amazing stuff. He just interviewed Douglas Trumbull, the visual effects guy for this movie, who also did 2001: A Space Odyssey. And Douglas Trumbull talks about like Paramount was going through like all kinds of panic because they'd spent like millions of dollars just trying to figure out visual effects and failing. So this movie, I think they were just more interested in just release anything. Please just release anything so we can make money. And that was it. And that may speak to why the final product is so long. I also don't know how much I want to say, TC. I don't want to.
I know. I'm kind of been biting my tongue about what to say about the movie.
Well, you're all confirming the things that I've heard, that it's kind of boring and resembles 2001: A Space Odyssey in more than one way.
I'm impressed at your childhood attention span, Shawn.
I'm amazed too. I will be completely honest, I actually really like this movie, which is really weird. But there's something about it. There are things I admire about it a lot. The soundtrack, for one. The soundtrack is great. It's great. And it's a big movie.
Is it NES Star Trek great?
It's not NES Star Trek great. But few things are, even outside the world of Star Trek. But the movie, because the budget was so big, it has this like epic scale that I don't think any of the other original Star Trek movies ever got. Because Wrath of Khan's budget was significantly lower than this. And it ended up paying off in spades because they actually had to bring some ideas to the table. But I think in this case, they were like, we got lots of money. Let's just put it all on screen and
throw
people
it on
will
visuals.
Love it.
Yeah.
I have seen Wrath of Khan.
Yes.
So
Wrath of Khan is great.
Yeah. I can only imagine this one will be just as good, right?
It'll be just as good, yeah.
It definitely looks pretty.
It looks great. It's a beautiful film. There's a lot to look at. There's just not a whole lot else. I don't know what to say about it without spoiling it. This is going to be better when we can come back and talk about it. I want to know, TC, what you know about the motion picture specifically. Do you know anything about the plot of the film? What do you think it is about?
I think that it doesn't have like a clear threat like Wrath of Khan does. It has a very singular villain. I feel like this movie is going to be a little more abstract in what the terms of the conflict are. But overall, no, I don't really know anything about the first Star Trek movie. Luckily, I feel like, with movies like Alien, there's so much cultural baggage that I went into Alien knowing a lot more than I do about Star Trek the motion picture. So.
Amazing. And you're always so tuned into pop culture that I'm kind of surprised that you don't know more about it.
Yeah.
I think Klingons are in this one, maybe, but I'm not
You're
sure.
not-
That's a
The fact-
possibility.
The fact
Wrong.
that I'm not positive is good. It's good. I like this.
Good. Yeah.
Yeah.
I think the motion picture has a bad rep. And I'm very curious to see what you think about it. The movie was not well received, and probably rightfully so, but I feel like we're going to be seeing this in theaters. I think it's the theatrical version. The director's cut is stronger from what I recall. I've seen both versions. And the director's cut cuts out some stuff, which I think helps move the movie along as much as is possible for this movie. They call it the Motionless Picture for a reason.
That's what I've
Sure
heard.
do.
Yes.
Yeah.
I don't know. I think in retrospect, with the benefit of time, without the insane expectations being placed on the movie, I think people's affections for it have been stronger in more recent years. I don't know. When was the last time you saw it, Leah?
It's been a few years.
Would you?
I've seen it twice.
If we weren't doing this,
but
would
it
you
was a
have
few years
willingly
ago.
gone out and seen this movie in
You
theaters?
know, I probably would, because I follow a lot of Star Trek pages on Facebook where people have been posting about going to see it this week. And it's made me wish I was there. I mean, I will be there.
Yeah.
But yeah, so I think seeing that would get me excited enough to go see it.
I agree.
You know, I received similar warnings about 2001 before I'd ever seen it, that it was kind of boring, and I braced myself for that. And 2001's amazing. You don't need me to tell you that. So who knows? Maybe this movie will be just as good.
And hopefully
yeah.
we've lowered the expectation enough that it can only go up from here.
I said this before, but I think I have a feeling my wife Sarah, she's not seen it either, and I've been kind of prepping her, but I think you guys are going to be maybe not pleasantly surprised, but I don't think you're going to be quite as upset as we're trying to make it sound like you will be.
Probably not.
Yeah, I do have one more fun story about this, and then we'll go boldly where no one has gone before. Star Trek: The Motion Picture for a long time was reliably the movie at a sleepover when my friends and I had been up past the point where it's like, guys, we've got to go to sleep. It's like 4 or 5 a.m. We can't we just got to go. The sun's coming up. I'm not tired. Are you tired? No. All right. Well, we've got to sleep. Just put on Star Trek: The Motion Picture. And no joke, like I'll tell you afterwards what the point was, but there was a certain point in the movie where every time without fail, we would all be gone by that point in the movie. Without fail.
And
Does
if
that
that
excite
doesn't
you? I
say
mean,
something-
is that the most exciting thing? Does that make you pumped to watch this movie?
I'll have some coffee first, is what I'm hearing.
It's probably a good
Me
idea.
too.
Yeah. Everyone should have some coffee before watching this. But let's do it.
All right.
Now available to own on video cassette.
All right, we're back. TC, I need to hear all the friendship messages you're feeling about Star Trek: The Motion Picture immediately.
That was a very long episode of Star Trek.
It feels so long. I don't know if it's because I have only watched the special edition in recent memory, which I think cut certain moments out of this to make it feel a little less long. But the movie felt like hours and hours.
It absolutely feels like an episode of Star Trek that they stretched and padded their way to a feature film.
I think
Yes.
that's exactly
and,
what it is.
And it is. And they already did this episode twice. There's the episode The Changeling. If you remember that one, it's almost exactly the same.
Is that in the original series?
In the original series,
Okay.
it's with the... it's another robot going rogue, but the robot's name is Nomad, and it's almost exactly the same plot, and Kirk has to talk Nomad out of it. And then there's another episode called The Ultimate Computer, where almost the same thing happens, but it's essentially the Enterprise, or the Mark V, I think it's called, but it's the Enterprise going rogue, and Kirk has to talk the Enterprise out of what it's going to do. So this is like the third time they've done almost the exact same man versus machine going rogue kind of thing.
That. That's like Roddenberry, one of his go-to
It's totally one of his
Because
go-tos.
if you're going the vibe, Roddenberry's whole thing was this is the future, and mankind has gotten over its petty differences. There's no conflict. Everyone gets along. It's like, wow, that's not interesting at all.
At least until you come and take over somebody else's ship.
Exactly. So that's, I think, fully on display in Star Trek The Motion Picture. Just this kind of like robotic stiffness because he was so involved with this movie. So we saw the movie in theaters, and there was like a 15-minute documentary beforehand, which is just the many of the major players in the crew just apologizing without coming out and actually apologizing, but basically like, yeah, we didn't think we'd ever make another one.
They tried to end it on a good note where they described going to see the film and saying like it's great, but everything up until then just seemed like them trying to sugarcoat their way to saying like this was a difficult movie to make and we did not have fun making.
We were so rushed. Really, guys, we were rushed. Can we tell you how rushed we were?
Well, the one guy was even like, we saw the movie and then we went out and grabbed some drinks. That was his reaction to the movie. But the whole production was like, first of all, there's a whole thing. And again, I want to plug my good friend Brad Gullickson, his interview with Douglas Trumbull, I believe the special effects supervisor, visual effects supervisor, some effects supervisor.
I saw his name in the credits.
He was the first name in the end credits. But he had an interview with Douglas Trumbull recently that's on Film School Rejects. And Trumbull talks about how Paramount was just like potentially going to go bankrupt if this movie did not go out. So there's a sense of just, they were like, just whatever, just please get something out that we can make money on, and we don't care what it is. But I didn't know that there was like Roddenberry, and then you had Robert Wise, who's the director, just kind of like, I guess trying to get approval from Gene Roddenberry, and then the scriptwriter, and then William Shatner and Leonard Nimoy, and everybody, this like panel of approvals that everything had to go through. And the movie feels about that stiff and calculated. There's not a lot of spontaneity to it. But as a person who's more of a Star Trek skeptic, like how... This is clearly not the first Star Trek thing you've seen, but if it had been, I don't know, can you put yourself in those shoes and just say like...
I can only imagine seeing this after seeing Star Wars in 1979, after seeing Star Wars 1977, and being sorely disappointed.
Yeah, I think that was the general reaction when this was released.
Stiff is definitely the word for it. Not as engaging as it was. I think it has earned its reputation as kind of a boring movie.
Yeah. But did you... So I guess the big question is, did you like or dislike it overall?
I lean more towards disliking. There are things to like about it. I think thematically, there's a lot that I like.
Yeah.
But you don't... It takes too long to get there. It's not that well done overall, I don't think. Just ultimately, it just seems like an episode they stretched, and so things don't come off the way they should. And I lean towards disliking it.
Yeah. What about so, Leah? This is the first time you've watched it in a while. Did you?
And definitely the first time in a theater.
Yes, first time in
which
a theater,
I think makes a big
well.
difference.
Yeah. So, what do you? How did you feel this time?
You know, I was probably watching it on a laptop the last time I watched it. Maybe both times I watched it. And if not, definitely a smaller screen than this. So it was a very immersive experience in a way that watching it on a laptop is not. Because watching those like 20 minutes of tracking shots into the cloud is, I mean, it can be rough. And we had some friends with us in the theater who haven't watched a lot of Star Trek before, and I was just thinking, oh, I hope they're not falling asleep over there. I'm sorry. Yes, I love this franchise. Don't judge me or judge Star Trek based on what you're saying.
There was kind of a feeling when the movie was over where we all kind of looked at each other, I feel like, and we're like, we're all still here. We're all good?
Yes, we're good. Is everyone awake? The human adventure is just beginning. Feels more like a threat than anything else.
Yeah.
It turns out the movie never actually ends. It just turns into the human adventure, and we're still living Star Trek the Motion Picture.
But I think you're right. I think thematically there's a lot to offer. I really love the idea of a sentient computer that is searching for God. That's such a cool, very sci-fi idea.
The religious feedback loop of man making a machine that becomes God that then seeks God and finds man.
Yeah.
There's a lot to like about that.
And it feels like a pretty classic Star Trek idea, like a very classic premise for a 40-minute episode of a Star Trek
Absolutely.
series.
And
Not necessarily a 2-hour feature film. But I have to admire the guts for them to, obviously the production was a mess. Obviously getting the story together was just insanity, and just cobbling something remotely coherent together is kind of a miracle. But I have to give them some credit for, like you said, this is 2 years after Star Wars, and that's all anybody wanted from anything science fiction. So for this movie to come out and be like, this is the other popular science fiction franchise, and we're going to just go in the polar opposite direction. We're going to tackle big ideas, and we're going to be lumbering and slow and methodical, way too methodical. That's kind of cool. And it's why I admire the motion picture. But watching it this time, I was like, this is such a boring movie.
It does
so
seem
boring.
like they wanted to take special care in showing things they might not be able to show in television. So
Yes,
long shots of the
absolutely.
ships actually lumbering through space. Those transporter accidents that I was always so sure were happening off screen. We finally get to see
Finally.
some of that.
And isn't it amazing that the transporter, even the transporter takes like what feels like hours to work. It's like everything in this movie happens so slowly. Even when the transporter is working correctly, it takes like a full minute for someone to get beamed up. And it's just like, God, everything about this movie is so slow.
Yeah, but you're right that you do see a lot of things that you haven't seen in Star Trek up till this point, probably because there's a much bigger budget in this movie than there ever was in the show. So you see things like, you see Klingons the way Roddenberry wanted them to be presented.
With the overbite?
Exactly.
With the Klingons in the original series look almost exactly like humans, and then I can't imagine being a fan of the original series going to see this movie and seeing these giant foreheads and clearly very differently designed aliens for the first time and being like, that's not Kling. What happened here?
Wait a second. And
hearing them speak for the first time in a language that's not, they only speak English in the original series, except for, well, no,
they
really
basically
only English.
look like Mongolians in the original series. Like, it's like they have like these almost twirly mustaches. They're kind
Beards.
of Vulcans, beards.
They
but
look
for the
a little
most part-
dirty.
Yeah, but for the most part, they look like humans.
Mm-hmm.
But I think aside from like seeing Klingons the way they will be seen for the rest of Star Trek's history,
Until Discovery.
and until the Abrams movies, isn't this also the first time we see photon torpedoes?
Oh, I don't know.
I think it might be. Someone out there can well actually me if I'm wrong, but I'm pretty sure this is the first
Sure
time
they
we
will.
see photon torpedoes in Star Trek. And boy, is it exciting. Is it used to the most exciting capacity.
Yeah.
But I think as a kid, because like I said, inexplicably, I was obsessed with this movie as a kid. And I think part of what attracted me so much to the movie is the idea of this unknowable entity that is capable of destroying everything. And that opening scene especially does a really solid job of like, what is this? This is like clearly a major threat, and it's wiping out Klingon vessels like nothing. It's wiping out Federation stations like nothing. And I remember as a kid just being like, how are you even going to stop it? What is Captain Kirk going to do? But that's an element that always stuck with me as a kid. But the first part, like the first act of the movie, does a pretty good job setting things up, I feel.
Setting up the Enterprise, for
Yes.
sure.
We spend a
were
lot of time
talking outside the theater about how we felt a little obscene watching 10 minutes of slow Enterprise shots with cuts back to Kirk's face where his bedroom eyes.
He wants to bang that ship so bad.
It's very pornographic.
When Scotty is referring late in the film to giving the Enterprise a proper shakedown, I could only think, you've already done it.
Yes. We've been there. We've seen it.
I will say, of all the long shots in this movie, that was the only one that I found truly laughable.
The Enterprise?
It was legitimately ridiculous to me. I think primarily it was the silence. Only having the music and having them just look in awe, not saying anything to one another, referring to Kirk and Scotty. It's just not...
That is the first of many sequences in this film that is just people staring at something while Jerry Goldsmith's magnificent score plays in the background. That way too good score for this movie that really makes those scenes watchable.
It's a good thing they had that score.
Yeah, without that music, God, I can't imagine. But a funny story, my wife Sarah was with us, and that I looked to her. I thought she was going to be like, she was looking at me, and I thought she was like, oh my God, this is going on. She actually got emotional during the scene where Kirk is, she was like, this is so beautiful.
I was ready for him to strike up a cigarette when he was done.
I mean, seriously. I don't know. Again, I think the pacing of the special edition, which for some reason is not available on Blu-ray, but the special edition, I think, cuts down some of the really long tracking shots, and it also improves some of the effects. But I don't remember it being quite as comically ridiculous with them just staring at things. Or it didn't... I knew that was this movie. I mean, I've seen this movie so many times, and I know that makes up so much of the movie. But God, how many times can we cut back to George Takei just like,
man, the Sulu face.
Yeah, the Sulu face.
The Sulu face was on, and the Ilea face. The Ilea big eyes.
She has a moment where she like hunches over, and she's like, I'm like, man, she's really like. Robert Wise is like, now you're scared. You're scared. That's terrifying. And she like really committed to that bit.
And then after she becomes V'ger's probe, then she's nothing but stares for the rest of the movie. And
but
those stares.
At least then she can get away with acting robotic.
Yes.
There was no excuse before that.
Well, we don't know what Deltons are like.
We don't. But we also, I guess I haven't watched this movie since I actually got into Star Trek, like the TV series. And I realized something. I turned to you and said this, but Deckard, the character of Deckard, is Riker.
Yes.
I didn't even connect.
And Ilea is Troy.
Yes. So phase 2, the idea for the series, they obviously took a lot of characters that would end up kind of providing the template for characters in Next Generation. But phase 2 also took those characters and turned them into Decker and Ilea.
The scene where they see each other for the first time is exactly like Riker and Troy seeing each other for the first time.
Sarah and I just rewatched the pilot, and it's exactly the same.
It's uncanny.
His name is even Will. It's Will Decker, not Will Riker. So lots of things like that I noticed. I also, again, just noticed the same plotting nature of the first couple seasons of TNG is just on full display here.
Oh yeah, I feel like that's Roddenberry coming in because he was, the first couple seasons of TNG was right before he died, and then it really picks up, whether it's because of his lack of involvement or not. It really picks up after that.
It is.
But yeah, I think it is. I think it's Roddenberry. He's a slow, plodding man, and he has his ideas, and he wants to explore them to the fullest over and over again. And he's
the expense of any human emotion. It's funny that the next, like the second scene, God, I can't imagine being not a Star Trek person and watching this movie and just being like, all right, there's a giant cloud that's zapping people into oblivion, and now we're on a weird lava planet, and Spock has a mullet now, and what's happening? So the idea of Kulinar, this Vulcan ritual that purges a Vulcan, I guess, of all emotion, even though Vulcans are already emotionless. I'm not exactly sure how that works?
I think it's like they're suppressing it most of the time,
Okay.
and this helps them like actually get rid of it.
So Spock is undergoing that
Yeah.
procedure. I feel like the ritual of Kolinar, which I don't know was ever mentioned in the series. I think this might be the first mention.
I don't think
of
so.
it. I feel like that scene is so representative of like the film's mood. It's like, let's just rob everything of all emotion.
Yeah, even visually, even down to the uniforms.
Yeah,
Because in
so
the original
sterile.
series, like you were talking about before, you were looking for those red, blue, and
Right.
yellow uniforms. And then they've got these super muted blue, like taupe beige kind of color, and like white. It's like everything
With weird
in this
power
movie.
morpher belt buckle.
Yeah, like down to the smallest visual detail, everything is meant to like strip you of emotion and leave this super calm feeling.
And the red shirts are like extras from Spaceballs, I guess. They all have that weird armor on in this one.
Yeah, the security guards
Yes.
have like football armor on.
Yes, those helmets.
I don't understand it. But the movie feels... That's something I don't know if as a kid I just thought was like a Star Trek thing and just didn't connect the dots. But as I've discovered Star Trek and come to appreciate Star Trek, I've appreciated how passionate it is and how endearing the characters are and how human everything is. And that's what Star Trek's strength really is. And coming back to Star Trek the Motion Picture after realizing that this is makes it all the more apparent how sterile this movie feels. But like, did you feel like there's some like
Yes.
nice human bits with Kirk and McCoy and Decker is, I think, a fun foil for Kirk in a way. But like, did you feel a connection with any character on any level whatsoever, TC?
I could relate to Spock a little.
You're like, I just want to be rid of all my emotions so I feel nothing.
I don't know if relate is the right word, but I felt like Spock had the most satisfying arc of any of the characters in the movie, just because he learns that he doesn't need to rob himself of
Yeah.
emotion to get by, because he sees what the ultimate end of that is and realizes it's not anything he wants a part of.
Yeah.
So I like that. And honestly, the only other character that I felt had a satisfying arc is V'ger.
Because I agree with you. That's something I never really noticed before. I didn't notice, I guess, now that I have a better understanding of Spock as a character, I never noticed how emotionless he is in the first half, and the moment he switches and kind of becomes Spock again is after he experiences the mind meld, and then he's calling Jim, and like that relationship is reestablished.
I think I got the most emotion from seeing him come on board that first time and just not be friendly to anyone.
Yeah.
And there's real emotion in that, because they've been on their 5-year mission, right? It's 5 years, right? And they've been through so much together, and for him to just act like they're not friends is so painful.
Yeah.
And I felt that. I felt like you're saying, the human interactions were the best part of the movie for the most part. I can't agree that Decker was a fun foil for Kirk. I will just say he was a foil for Kirk.
Yes, I will agree with that.
And what did you think about McCoy's character?
Oh, McCoy continues to be the best crew member of the original series, in my opinion.
He's great, but he also it feels like he was like second fiddle.
Yeah, he
in
doesn't
this
have
movie. He's just there because literally, like Kirk says this line a couple times. He needs people. I need you.
I
Damn
need
it,
you.
Bones, I need you. He says that to Bones. He says it about Spock.
Very
He's like,
intense
I need
about
him.
it.
I need him. But a lot of this movie is Kirk behaving like really selfishly,
Yes.
and like putting people in danger to serve his own selfish needs,
and then getting away with it.
and getting away with it. And it makes him a very not despicable character, because Kirk is kind of inherently likable because of Shatner, but like Kirk's not a particularly relatable or likable character in this movie. They kind of set him up to be like humbled, and he's kind of humble, and he like admits his faults to Decker, like, Decker, stop competing with me, Decker. But then Decker's like, dude, I'm here to do that. And he's like, you're right.
Yeah.
But like, I don't know what his arc is supposed to be, because he behaves selfishly the whole time, and just like the way he's like, I need these people around me. I need the Enterprise back. I'm going to put this entire crew in danger because I want to go on this adventure. And it just felt like Kirk felt kind of icky in a way I never noticed before in this movie.
I think Kirk's arc starts here, and I think it really comes to a climax in Star Trek II.
Yeah.
Because that's when you see Kirk get humbled. And I don't know if I should spoil things.
I think for Wrath of Khan.
Yeah.
Well, I assume if people are listening to this episode as Star Trek fans and they haven't seen Wrath of Khan, they're not really
And if I'm
Star
not
Trek
mistaken,
fans.
I
think we spoiled it in
TC.
part 1.
I think we did.
And
too.
I've seen Wrath of Khan.
Yes. We've all seen Wrath of Khan, so I think we're good. And I
Okay.
assume our listeners have too, otherwise I'm ashamed of you.
Yeah, well, when I think we were talking about it in part 1, when Spock dies, that's when I think Kirk is, you see him getting humbled, and you have that arc of Kirk's arrogance and him getting what he wants to back that up. And
Star Trek 2 is also basically Star Trek 1. Like, this movie does not need to, like, motion picture does not need to exist. It exists because Paramount saw an opportunity to make money, and they were like, we've got Star Trek, let's throw it out there, let's put a budget to it, and let's hope for the best. Star Trek 2 is the first real Star Trek movie. Mm-hmm. I think Wrath of Khan lacks the big cerebral ideas of the motion picture, which some would argue is what Star Trek's all about. I disagree. I think it's about the characters and the relationships. And the reason Star Trek 2 stands alone is because, like you said, the journey Kirk goes on in Star Trek 2 is self-contained to Star Trek 2. You don't need to have seen any other Star Trek to understand who Kirk is and the journey he's going on. You are enriched if you know who he is and you know who the characters are outside of Star Trek 2. But that's what makes a great movie to me, is when you can sit down, watch it from beginning to end, not needing you don't need the context. You don't need to have seen the series to really appreciate Wrath of Khan and the story it's telling. Whereas motion picture was like, the thrill of it, I feel like, is probably fans being like, oh my God, it's them. They've been gone. They've been off the air for over a decade. This is so cool to see them all back together again. And then you have to put up with another 2 hours of very plotting movie.
And it's kind of funny that Gene Roddenberry wasn't heavily involved in The Wrath of Khan. And he was very...
Funny, or is it now the mystery is starting to unveil?
I mean, clearly everything Star Trek is because of him. Like, he was the visionary.
Yes.
But as
I'm being kind of a jerk.
as a dude on the ground making it happen, maybe when he had the reins taken from him, it led to better Star Trek.
Yeah. It was just the sterileness. I think his idea of, like, it's a utopia, everyone gets along. It's like, it just doesn't work for human drama.
Well, as a Star Wars fan, I know nothing about creator decay.
It never happens with our favorite boys over in a galaxy far, far
George
away.
Lucas is just as stayed creatively relevant his entire life. Love you, George.
Ain't that the truth? So I want to know what stuff worked for you. We talked about V'ger. We talked a little bit about the plot elements. The movie is very slow in plotting, but there are moments I feel like that really work for me. Are there any bits and pieces that worked for you, TC, and also Leah as well?
Well, I talked about Spock's arc. I still think that's the most satisfying part of the whole movie for me. I liked a lot of the colors when they were going into the wormhole and things like that. The weird color effect.
Yeah.
Not so much the slowdown, which felt to me like more padding, but
relay that phaser
away. But I liked the color schemes there. I didn't hate the new outfits, honestly. The different outfits, I was okay with that. I liked a lot of. I mean, just going back to the human elements, that initial conflict between Kirk and Decker was interesting until it got really, really annoying with Decker just being like, "Well, I disagree," in every single scene.
Yeah, and also it resolves itself very quickly. Like the conflict is gone.
I'm not sure that it ever resolves itself, actually. Kirk kind of just bullies his way into everything. And Decker decides, you know what, Kirk, I'm going to ascend to a higher plane of existence and screw you. I also think it's, if while I'm harping on Decker, I got to get this out. So the woman he loves dies in front of him. His first reaction is to snark off at Kirk. That's what I call unwarranted. With no emotion.
That's completely true.
And in that entire scene, he shows no emotion for the woman he loves dying. But then later, he's like, oh, now I'm upset.
Yeah.
Now that she's a probe and is in front of me, now I'm sad.
Yeah, that's true.
I was like, you've clearly been holding that one back to whip out at Kirk when the situation turned poor.
He was like,
you were
as
just
soon as
waiting.
something terrible
He was
happens.
clearly just waiting. Not a fan.
It's true.
Not a Decker fan.
I guess when I say it resolves itself, I mean the conflict is basically like, I'm captain of the ship. Back off. And Decker's like, I was going to be the captain. And he's like, well, you're not now. And Decker's like, okay. And that's basically it. It's like it immediately,
after a few scenes.
There's no drama in this movie. There's no drama. Yeah, it's like that's the extent of the drama. And then there's like a melodramatic romance between Leah and Decker. But I don't know. Leah, what are there standout moments for you or things that really work for you?
Yeah, well, so I think that the movie, I kind of think of it as more of an art piece than a movie. That's a weird thing to say. I mean, it is a movie, but all of the visuals I think really work well together, and the combination of the visuals and the musical score I think create this atmosphere that transmits calm and there's a definite mood. There's a heavy mood going on in this. Maybe it's boredom.
To a sense of like, man, I could take a long nap.
So, some of those initial shots of the cloud looked exactly like a magic eye.
Yeah.
Do you notice that? There were some that, like, literally, like, I was wondering if there was something secret to be seen in there.
While we're talking about lulling people to sleep, can you guess the scene that would put me to sleep?
So Leah had a theory.
Okay.
What scene did you think that Shawn and was it your friends at a sleepover?
Yeah, sleepover whenever
when
we
they're
needed to put
going
on
into the cloud, I assume.
I see. Watching it now, I was like, "Oh yeah, this is definitely." But you're giving the movie too much credit. We would be out the second Scotty and Kirk go on the Enterprise love fest. We would be done. It would be done. But like
that
watching the cloud stuff, I remember really loving as a kid. Like thinking, like, "Oh, this is so cool." But maybe because I've seen 2001: A Space Odyssey now, I'm just now like, "All right, I'm good. I get it. It's a weird cloud. There are cool lights, but."
I can piggyback off that. I did really like not necessarily the pretty lights part of the cloud, but the actual interior of the cloud I thought looked really cool in a lot of parts. The weird section that they go through with the 4 like urchin looking things.
Yeah,
yes.
the orangish.
I was like, what
eggs.
are those for?
Yeah.
Like,
Spiky eggs.
what does it possibly need to defend itself from?
I like that a lot. I like the mystery of. I think as a kid, that like kind of introduced me to this idea of. I guess what David Lynch does with his whole career, where it's like, I don't know what it is and I don't want to know what it is. I just know that it's weird and creepy and I like it.
It's like creating some kind of state for you to enter. Like you're not following a plot, you're just kind of entering a state.
Well, I like that you bring up the mood. This movie feels very cinematic. Like it's shot by, it's made by a director, like a film director who had the credits. It wasn't just like a guy, let's just hire somebody who directed a couple episodes of television. It's like, it's a legit, like the guy knows what he's doing. They do a couple like, I can't remember the name of the kind of shot it is, but basically you have both elements. You have one element close to the camera. You have one element far away. They're both in focus, but it creates a blur. In between, or it creates a blur around or an aura around a character. I wish I could remember what the technique's called, but they do
noticed
it a
that
lot.
several times.
Yeah. It was very pronounced, maybe because we were watching it on the big screen, but it felt very obnoxious to me. But there's a lot of there's a lot of technique in this movie that you feel like you're kind of, like you said, this is more of an art piece than a movie, kind of. It's like you have to approach it from that sensibility. And you appreciate the technique and you appreciate like the cinematic scope of it, but at the same time it's like there isn't much else to connect you to it.
As far as other things, as far as character-wise, I think McCoy is great.
He's great because he's the most human character. Like, it's like he reacts to things normally. It's like it makes people endeared to him because when he cracks a joke, we're all thinking, it's like, yeah, that's the truth.
Yeah.
Like, you actually are having legit human reactions in this very cold, sterile movie where everyone is behaving very robotically.
And they took some liberties with his character. Like, I don't remember him ever being afraid of the transporter before. Suddenly he's anti-Starfleet, he's anti the transporter, and he looks like he just walked out of the Sergeant Pepper cover.
Maybe he was there for the transporter accident.
Yeah,
from
seconds ago,
scenes away or whatever.
Yeah.
That's also, the movie has like a darkness to it that not a lot of Star Trek movies or Star Trek material has. Like the weirdness of it is very pronounced. It's a very it's a sterile movie, but it's very cold, and there's this like undercurrent of eeriness, and the transporter scene is one of those scenes where like these people like, oh, what does she say? Oh no, they're forming.
Oh, they're forming.
And it's like, what does that mean? I don't know, but now these people are like screaming, and it's weird, and it's like a very dark. Like it's Star Trek. No, it's like weird and creepy, and we're gonna explore this weird spaceship for hours and hours and hours.
Somehow this feels like Kirk's fault.
This is all Kirk's fault. I think it's just the general mood of the movie is so detached. The series, I mean, the original series is not the most natural. There is a stiffness and kind of a corniness to it. But there is also...
It's a little campy.
Yeah, it's campy, but there's organic human emotion in it. And there is a sense of fun and the sense of adventure. And this movie is just like fully embracing like the darkness of like... It's not like so much like what's out there. It's like, oh God, what's out there? Like, what are we going to run into? What terror is awaiting us in space? It's something I admire about the motion picture, but also it's like feels like the antithesis to Star Trek's whole point, like that coldness.
I don't know that I agree with it.
Okay,
with that. I think them ending on a note like the human adventure is just beginning is very hopeful.
Yeah,
and Kirk, for as much as I'm pretty sure no one gave him orders to do this, at the end of the movie, just takes the Enterprise out there. He's just like, go that way, and they go, and it seems very hopeful in that way.
Yeah, but it's the last minute of the movie.
True. Yeah.
The rest of the movie is just sad.
Ends hopeful, but they didn't have a hopeful tone for most of it.
I hate when movies do that. It's like same. This is completely unrelated, but Spider-Man: Far From Home did a similar thing where it's like the teaser at the post-credits teaser. It's like, oh, I want to see that movie. Why wasn't this movie that movie? Star Trek: The Motion Picture is the same thing.
You leave Spider-Man: Far From Home out of this.
This whole podcast is just an excuse for me to complain more about Far From Home. But really, I think Star Trek can get dark, but I don't know. Do you get that vibe from Motion Picture at all? Does what I'm saying make sense, or am I just crazy?
Absolutely. I mean, it's dark, but it's also very slow, and there's not a lot of drama that I think the audience is invested in. And different Star Trek series do darkness in different ways. Like Deep Space Nine is a pretty dark series overall, but it's also a very... emotional series. There are highs and lows in a way that there aren't in the motion picture. So the motion picture just seems kind of even keel in terms of emotion. We were talking about how it also feels stripped of emotion. And so yeah, it's a weird kind of different sort of calm darkness. Like it's just kind of stepping back and observing the darkness instead of getting really caught up in it.
With comparing it to the episodes of the original series I'm familiar with, it just doesn't seem that different to me tonally. They go out into space, they meet something they've never met before, they lose a few people, and then they move on with their lives, and the next episode happens.
But they're laughing the whole time, and when McCoy and Spock are at each other's throats in the original series, it's always a joke.
Yeah.
And there's not a lot of joking in the motion picture.
Yeah, but that's a good point. I mean, I think I have a couple friends. My friend Matt Schott is a big Star Trek fan, and he loves the motion picture, but he specifically referenced that. He's like, it is very in line with the series where they kind of go off and explore something or an idea, like a big idea, and they kind of analyze it and they pick it apart, and then like it resolves and people die. This movie is more in line with like an episode. We talked about that. It feels like a way too long episode. I guess I'm missing but then there are episodes like what we were talking about. City on the Edge of Forever is typically cited as the best of the original series, and that's a very emotional, very human episode. Sometimes I wonder, am I just connecting to something that is actually rare for Star Trek? At least in the original series, it feels like those episodes are not as common.
Yeah. It seems like in all of the series, the episodes that are usually cited as the best episodes are ones that are a little bit different from the rest. So like City on the Edge of Forever is very different from the rest of the series. For one thing, it doesn't really take place on the ship. And it takes place back in time, and it's about Kirk's relationship with a woman. And yeah, it's not really about a space exploration thing. And then there are similar things like the episode The Inner Light in The Next Generation, which is often cited as the best Star Trek episode, at least of that series. Yeah. And that one also doesn't take place on the ship. It's about like Picard's relationship with people on another planet, and he's living this other life. And so yeah, it's like those episodes are often the best, but they're not necessarily representative of what's going on in the rest of the show as a whole. Like, they're on like madcap adventures a lot of times, but when they're at their best, it is kind of a slowed down, emotional kind of journey.
Yeah. The best episodes tend to mix and match the two ideas, like the big concepts with the more emotional stuff.
Yeah.
And motion picture is too far in the direction of just like big idea. And Wrath of Khan is like doesn't have as many big ideas, but it has like the passion and the heart that like you need to make a movie work. But so the sequences that work for me in this movie are actually the non-action sequences, like the wormhole scene. I really love that. I remember as a kid thinking like, yes, the wormhole scene is coming up. That's so exciting because something's happening and it looks really weird. I really like when the probe shows up on the ship. There's the giant strip of light that just zaps everything. And then Spock's journey, so the journey into V'ger through the cloud in the Enterprise is way more boring than I remember it being. Like, I remember really liking it as a kid and now just being like, God, I don't care. But Spock's journey I really liked. For some reason that was way more interesting. Maybe because there's a more human connection to it because he's exploring and commenting on everything, whereas V'ger's exploration is just people staring at things for what feels like way too long.
Spock's journey was probably my favorite scene of the movie.
It's the strongest visual sequence, I think. But
yeah,
I don't know if there's any other... I don't know if there are any real standout moments otherwise for me. Like, I like the confrontations between Decker and Kirk at the beginning, and they kind of disappear. And I think Ilea as the robot is hysterical, and the fact that she calls Kirk Unit and Kirk Unit. Them like they're like, maybe if we trigger her memories, and they put on this ridiculous headband. That
she wore this.
She wore this.
We promise.
That was a funny moment.
She goes, I think Ilea mentioned she wore something like this, and it's like, wait, what? Did she mention it? And you never saw her wear it.
I barely know her, but I'm pretty sure.
But it's such a weird, like, I don't know. There's something about it, even though that stuff is ridiculous, the weird, emotionless angle of the movie is almost kind of why I find it strangely interesting. I don't know. I know I've been criticizing the coldness and the weirdness and the darkness, But that's also what makes the motion picture so hard to dismiss. Like when people are like, I hate this movie, I'm like, I don't hate it. I don't think it's particularly good, and I understand why people wouldn't like it. But I don't think it's like something you can just so easily dismiss. It's not like Star Trek 5. Please forget. I know, Brad, please, if you're listening to this episode, don't hate me. But it's not like Star Trek 5 where it's like, this is just cheap and it's goofy and it's dumb. Like Star Trek the Motion Picture has a grandeur to it, and there's a sense of something happening beneath the surface. It just doesn't quite click.
Yeah, there's a surrealness to it, and definitely a grandeur. Like we see the Enterprise looking tiny, and the Enterprise is usually so big and powerful, and then it's like minuscule in comparison to the cloud.
As big and powerful early in the movie. It's like, look at the Enterprise.
Yeah, and then it shrinks down, and like it looks like it's tiny inside of the cloud, and so there's definitely a grandeur to it.
I like Shatner in this movie because he's Shatner. And he's really good. And people make fun of him, but I think the way he performs brings a very naturalistic quality to Kirk, that even when he's being a complete dick, he's also like, there's something endearing about him.
I feel like you get peak Shatner in this movie in terms of what people think of when they think of Shatner playing Kirk.
Would you please sit down?
And the pauses between phrases. I had more than a few Zach Brannigan moments watching him in this movie.
Is there a favorite Kirk moment in this movie that we can point out? My favorite, I love the stop competing with me, Decker. That's my favorite.
Would you please sit down? It's pretty good.
Yeah, I think mine is one of the many times where he's like, I need you.
Damn it, Bones. I need you. Yeah.
Or when he's exasperated watching Epsilon 9 get destroyed, he's like, view screen off. Yeah.
It's like, you couldn't have done that earlier. Did you have to make everybody watch that? Also, the crowd, I never noticed, like, they're like Native Americans in the crowd.
And some of them are clearly uninterested.
Yes. Like, some of them don't care. I guess Roddenberry was like, yes, my idea of the future is so diverse that even Native Americans are part of my future. And I was like, yeah, wearing their, like, headwear and very pronounced in the
I heard
crowd.
they wore something like that once.
Yes. But I love they're like little funny moments that are like, oh, that feels like Star Trek to me, like when the probe is in there and Decker goes, don't interfere, and Chekhov goes, absolutely, I will not interfere. I think that's so funny. And then the rest of the movie, everyone is just like angry and just sad and like staring, just gaping at things. But
yeah, I feel like we could have gotten more from the reunion, because this is supposed to be the crew all coming back together after 2.5 years of being separated. And I don't know that we get enough sense of a reunion.
Yeah,
like when Kirk comes up and takes command, it's a little awkward. Like he walks on the bridge and everyone walks up and looks at him and smiles at him, and everyone stares at each other in silence for a second with these big smiles on their faces. And I mean, Star Trek loves to do reunions. Like they love to do the crew coming back together for one final mission. But I think there was probably an opportunity for more of a reunion.
Probably a better movie. That would have been the way better. Like, can you imagine if this had been like a getting the band back together type movie where it's like maybe there is a threat or maybe there is something out there, and like the first act is Kirk he's like, I got to get the crew back. This is the only people who can do this, and he like has to go around and recruit everybody and like pull them.
Or if you'd
that would have been so much better.
And then for the soundtrack, hear me out. Beastie Boys.
Sabotage
over and over and over.
Or if you'd seen a little bit of Kirk's life over the last 2.5 years, something, because the people who were fans of the movie when it came out, the last time they'd seen them, the whole crew was all together. And then as soon as the movie starts, it's like the crew is back together as soon as the movie starts. So if there had been some intro where you'd seen them separate, seen what their lives looked like, and then gotten them back together, I think that could have been pretty cool.
It also reminds me that like Sulu and Uhura and Chekhov are really just the types. Like they, even in the series, they didn't really do anything. They were just kind of like, they were striking personalities, but they didn't really, the movie like I remember like thinking like, oh God, they don't really do much. But then also they didn't really do much in the original series either.
I think I would agree about Chekhov.
Sulu
but
he gets a shirtless scene where he like fences.
Yes, he gets the shirtless scene, and Uhura I think is actually pretty interesting. Like you get her backstory, you get her like speaking Swahili, and you get her singing and dancing, and like flirting and being a full kind of character. So those two, Chekhov, I don't know. He's
a mystery.
He's kind of a.
In this movie specifically, I did find myself wondering what Uhura's like regular day looked like, just sitting at that screen, sort of like bouncing signals back and forth to see what worked. And it's like, oh, no, it bounced that one back too. Sorry, Captain.
I did my best.
Yeah, they could have.
So in this movie
better used
specifically,
her in
yeah,
this
I
movie.
think Sulu made a lot of funny faces.
Yes.
And Uhura said a lot of things.
Was there anything else that you might have? Because when we asked you what you thought the movie was about, and you were talking about like the threat and maybe Klingons were involved.
Yeah.
True.
There was a threat. Klingons
Yes,
were involved.
Klingons were involved for about 5 minutes. But was there anything that really surprised you about the movie as far as like what you thought it might be versus what like?
Like I said, thematically, there are things to like about it. The Voyager stuff was something I didn't know going in. I think I had heard it years ago or something, but it's not something I absorbed.
That's
so
a
luckily,
cool little twist at the end.
until
I like that.
until the featurette before the movie spoiled it for me.
Oh, that's right.
I would have
Yes.
gone in not knowing, but I do wonder what when I would have figured it out, because V'ger, the illusion is there, and I don't know. I wonder when I would have figured it out.
Yeah.
But I liked the Voyager stuff a lot. That was really interesting.
Yeah. Is there anything in particular that you might have appreciated a little more, Leah? Or is it still kind of like, nope, this is I'm good. I don't need to watch this again unless I need a nap. Sometimes when you like dislike a movie so strongly and you go back and rewatch it, it's kind of like, oh, maybe that wasn't so bad. Did you have that with this, or was it still kind of the same?
I think it was pretty accurate to what I remembered, even though it had been, and I'm sure that it was a better experience watching it on a big screen, but I was still thinking during those long shots of the Enterprise and long shots going into V'ger, I was still having the same boring thoughts. So.
Yeah, that killed me. I was pretty like okay with the movie, and I was like, yeah, it's a little slow, but like the V'ger stuff really grinds it to a halt.
I was really interested in that machine planet we saw,
Yes.
just like a snippet of.
Yeah.
And then I was like, V'ger knows its name based on what it can read off of itself,
Right.
Right?
Yeah.
But it can't detect the missing letters that are underneath. Oy.
Yeah, who read
Yeah.
that and who translated it into the like English
Did
word
did
V'ger?
no
then-
machine decide, like say, hey, maybe we should wipe off the rest of this
Yeah.
label and
Right.
figure out what this really is?
So there's
A lot
those
of
machines,
questions.
and then Decker and the probe go off to make babies or whatever. So my question is, did Star Trek the motion picture invent the Borg?
Oh, maybe. Could they
That's
have,
interesting.
Yeah, has anyone talked about that? Could that have been the first instance of like Borg?
Because they're a
It seemed-
fusion of man and machine,
Yeah.
right? This is our next evolutionary step. It turns out it's Borg.
It's
They
Borg.
were right. Evolution is futile? No, never mind. That doesn't work.
Oh my God.
That would be great.
Wow, I wonder if
It could be. I think the idea, and it's one of those
Get your
things
fan
that's like
fiction pen out.
Yes, it's one of those things where it's like it happened and we'll never talk about it again because V'ger never comes back. It's never mentioned. There's
like-
never anything remotely similar to the same threat.
They meet a god every other week in the
True.
original series. This is just standard operating
In Star Trek
procedure.
5, they go searching for God.
Yeah.
I think it's a very similar plot.
Is that the what does God need with a
Yes.
starship?
What does God
movie?
need with a starship?
They
Yeah.
allude to that in the. I don't think you were there for that portion of the featurette, but they alluded to the fact that the motion picture was supposed to have big religious themes, but that those got rejected, and a lot of them ended up in
Star Trek 5, and where we can
world
absolutely
wasn't
see
ready.
why they were rejected.
Yeah.
But
they saved religion for Deep Space Nine.
yes, need to watch Deep Space Nine. Does this pique interest in Star Trek? Is this something, like you said, we had our friends there who'd never really seen much of Star Trek. This is like the movie I feel like people think Star Trek is. Like they think, like when you see this movie, you're like, oh, that's why I don't like Star Trek. It's boring and cold and dumb. But I don't know. Is this something where like I feel like I already know the answer to this, but my question is like, based on motion picture, is there any interest in Star Trek? Like, would you then go off and say like, yeah, I actually do want to see where the series came from, where it ended
well, isn't
up?
that kind of how it worked for you?
Yeah, I mean,
this was your intro to Star Trek, other than the video game.
Yeah, Star Trek Search for Spock was, but I knew Next Generation. Like this was my.
Oh yeah,
I knew Next Generation, and I was not aware of Kirk or Spock or anybody. Picard and everybody was Star Trek to me. It's funny to think that there was a world, or there was a time where people were like, no one without Spock, there is no Star Trek. And to me, it was like, oh, Data, Geordi, Picard. That's what Star Trek is. But that was my introduction to Star Trek, and then I saw Star Trek 3, and the motion picture came later. But as a kid, I think I was fascinated by like the big ideas and the effects, and I just love the characters so much that even in a movie where they're not used to their most effective capacity, I still like enjoyed being on an adventure with them. Yeah, but
I don't think I would show this movie to someone as their intro to Star Trek. Yeah, no,
I would not.
I would say if I didn't know anything going in, I wouldn't be 0% interested in learning more. I would, particularly Bones and Spock, I would want to know more about those characters. But the chances of me following up would be low based solely on this movie. And like I said, not 0%, but pretty low.
Yeah. And this is a question I've asked myself many times over the years, because I've had friends who have been interested in Star Trek and have asked where to start. So I've read the lists online that different people have created as the starting points, and have recommended some things that have gone over better or worse than I thought they would. But this, I don't think the motion picture is the answer.
No. And it clearly wasn't at the time. People, I don't even think fans really embraced this movie until it feels like now there's kind of a resurgence where people are like, oh yeah, I can appreciate that. But I don't know. I mean, the movie clearly made money, even though it was kind of blasted by critics. But this is still not a movie that is held in high regards with fans, or like, I don't know.
Yeah.
It's kind of I feel kind of bad because it's like, again, the movie had such a troubled production history that you kind of feel like everybody's to blame and nobody's to blame, and the fact that the movie exists at all is kind of like, hey, way to go, you did it.
We can all agree we like the music.
Yes, the music's great.
I thought it was funny that the Next Generation theme plays, since this was technically going to be the Next Generation.
Yeah.
But I think we can at least thank Star Trek the Motion Picture for getting all that out of its system, so that you could then get the real Next Generation.
It's true. And honestly, I think I would typically have people probably start with Star Trek 2 because it's so good, and it's a way better example of what Star Trek is capable of when it's working. But at the same time, I like have a fondness for motion picture. I just like it. I just wouldn't recommend it to anybody.
That's fine.
Is there anything else we can say about the motion picture? Have we exhausted all the friendship messages?
No more friendship
messages for Star Trek the Motion Picture. I think so. That's really all I have to say about it. It's like
the creator does not respond.
The creator, where is the creator? Am I the creator? So a rating scale, what should we do? On a scale from 1 to 5,
Sensors.
1 to 5 belay phaser orders. How many would you give the motion picture, TC?
There's a part of me that wants to give it 2. I'm gonna be nice and give it 3.
Okay.
Out of 5.
Okay. What about you,
Sensors.
Leah? Sensors.
I'll give it a 2.
Okay. I'm gonna go in the middle and say 2.5. I think if I'm being
I didn't know halves were an option.
were allowed. Shawn.
halves are totally. This is.
I stick with
We
two.
are the creator of half stars.
All right, 2 3/4 stars.
I stand by 2.
I give it a 2.7. No, but I also will give it that rating with the caveat of I kind of still like have a love for this movie that I can't explain.
Totally,
even
okay.
though I don't particularly find it enjoyable, especially this recent viewing, this last viewing. I was very struck by how boring it was, which has never really struck me before. But yeah, there you go.
There we
Star
go.
Trek: The Motion Picture. I'm glad. I'm sure you're glad to have checked another 40th anniversary off your list. Superman, Alien, and Star Trek: The Motion Picture.
1978, 79. What a good stretch of cinema.
Good stretch of cinema for sure. But where, if people want to talk to you and yell at you for either not liking Star Trek: The Motion Picture enough or wearing a Star Wars shirt to the Star Trek podcast, where can they find you?
They can
on the internet.
Catch me outside. How about that? No, go to @TC Padgett on Instagram. That's the most active I am on social media is on Instagram.
Perfect. What about you, Leah?
And mine is Leah Hale Design on Instagram.
Yay. And I'm at Shawn Dorman on Twitter, at Shawn Dorman on Instagram. And feel free to chat with all of us about Star Trek. It's the 40th anniversary. So let's hear all the apologists coming out of the woodwork. I want to hear all the opinions, all the feelings, all the emotions, or lack thereof, because there aren't many emotions or feelings in this movie. But you can feel all kinds of emotions if you want, because the human adventure that is Missing Frames is only just beginning, and we can continue on if you give us a 5-star rating on iTunes. It has to be 5 stars. No, it doesn't. But if it is and you write a review, I'll read your review. I'll read it with such great gusto you won't even know how to handle it. And I am so happy, Leah and TC, that we got to do this. Thank you so much for being on the
Shawn.
show. And I hope next time we'll watch a movie that makes us all a little less sleepy.